Hello and welcome to another podcast. Today I am talking to Tal Ben-Shahar. We will be talking about his work around the idea of the science of happiness. We'll be talking about simplify. We'll also be exploring goal setting. And as a coach, I'm really curious to hear Tal's thoughts around that. Great to have you on the call today, Tal.
Great to be here, Robert. Thank you.
So, Tal, I'm sure a lot of people will be interested to know about. So, how do you define the idea of the science of happiness?
The science of happiness is essentially taking the tools, the scientific tools, and applying them to how we can live the good life. For centuries and millennia, people have been talking about happiness, though the conversations were mostly philosophical, poetic.
Hmm.
And don't get me wrong, I'm not against philosophy or poetry. However, now we have data that we can employ for the purpose of living a healthier, happier, better life.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to talk about, having that data, that scientific data that we can sort of pinpoint things around. Often when people talk about being happy, there's this very looseness to it, this
Yeah.
very kind of this sense of there is a feeling that one is striving for. And when something happens, that feeling will appear as opposed to applying tools to creating that feeling.
Yeah, and I think this is a misunderstanding of what happiness is on a few levels. The first level is that a happy life is not a life that is devoid of painful emotions. So sadness, anger, frustration, envy, even hatred, these are all natural human emotions. And the only people who don't experience these painful emotions are psychopaths or dead people. So the fact that we all experience it doesn't mean that none of us can be happy. We can be happy and have all these emotions. So that's the first thing. The second thing, happiness is not just about an emotion. So yes, emotion is part of happiness. In addition, also a sense of meaning and purpose is a very important part of happiness. Physical health is also an important part of happiness. Learning, growing, curiosity, intellectual well-being is a part of happiness, as of course are relationships, which are the number one predictor of happiness. So all these things together create what my colleagues and I have come to call whole person well-being, or in short, whole being.
Whole being, it feels like a really almost like a warm phrase, that whole being. It feels like it kind of wraps itself around you. And there's something that sort of strikes me, that misunderstanding of happiness, as a coach and a trainer of coaches. I noticed that clients come into the space going, I want to be happy and I want to discard all those other feelings. They don't say it
Mm.
in those words, but there is this idea that when I am happy, I will no longer be sad, angry, envious, jealous. Those things won't exist. I'll just have this kind of perpetual state of happiness. And it's really interesting that you're saying that these things are a part of happiness. That happiness isn't one or the other.
Yeah, and I'd also say another thing. When it comes to coaching in particular, I mean, coaching is so much about action. That is one of the distinguishing characteristics, say, between coaching and therapy,
Hmm.
that you're action oriented. And to my mind and heart, action trumps emotions, action trumps thoughts. Because we can have all different kinds of emotions. We can have emotions that we that are painful, that we would perceive as perhaps negative. However, that doesn't make us a good or a bad person. Emotions are simply emotions. They're natural. They exist. What makes us a good person or a bad person is our behavior.
Hmm.
Similarly with thoughts, we can have radical thoughts in our head. What matters more is not what we think, but rather what we do. So that bias for action that coaching emphasizes, to my mind, is a justified and just bias.
And I think there's something really interesting about action, because when we remove action, because sometimes in coaching, our clients and ourselves will say, yeah, I'm going to go and do this, I'm going to do that, and these are my next steps, and then those things don't happen, and when they don't happen, we don't create that change. And so
Mm.
the action enables those changes to take place. Is our behaviors, those shifts in behaviors allow that to come into play. And when we just get caught in the sort of the thoughtness of it without the acting of it, we can become a great person in our minds, but how do we become a great person in the world? How do we show up in that way?
Yeah, and obviously, thoughts matter, and our very conversations with our coachees are, cognitive,
Mm,
intellectual, cerebral conversations, and yet they're only the first step of a 1,000-mile journey. And the rest of the 1,000-mile is all about action, or as Thomas Edison put it, it is 1% inspiration, but the other 90%, 99% is perspiration.
mm,
It's taking action. Now, the interesting thing is also that there is a connection, a two-way connection between thoughts and action. So yes, you go through a coaching session and you decide that you're going to do certain things. That the decision, that's a thought process. And then you do it. But it doesn't end there, because you doing it also affects your thoughts. So, so this whole talk about, fake it till you make it, or even better, in the words of Amy Cuddy, fake it till you become it.
yeah.
That's so important, and it has roots deep roots in the science of happiness. So Daryl Bem, who taught at Cornell University back in the 1960s, created self-perception theory. What is self-perception theory? What he argued is that we create theories about ourselves in the same way that we create theories about others. How is that? By observation.
Mm,
So, for example, if I observe someone behaving nicely, kindly toward other people, being nice, I'll say, oh, nice person, kind. If I see someone hurting another, I'll say, the opposite, not so kind. Um, so we derive conclusions about others through observations. His argument is that we do the same to ourselves. If I see myself behaving in a certain way, I will derive conclusions about myself.
yeah.
For example, I may be afraid, I may be experiencing real trepidations, not wanting to do something. But if I go ahead and do something, I will derive conclusions based on my action. Oh, I must be courageous. And that becomes my self-perception. So my action actually determines my thoughts as well as my feelings. And I go back, action trumps emotion.
I love that sort of loop that creates, that we think about something, we do something, that impacts how we think about something, that impacts what we do. And so there's almost this idea, I suppose, that perhaps in coaching it's the impetus to creating change, because it's the thing that jump starts where we go to. And that idea that we create this perception of ourselves. Sometimes we might talk about the ideal self, where we go, what would that look like, sound like, feel like? What would I be doing? What would I be saying? How would I be sounding? And perhaps using visualizations to create that and go, that's how I see myself. Right now I can become that because I see it, or I start to inhabit that vision of self.
Yeah, and Robert, I love the fact that you use the word loop, because that's exactly what it is. It's not a, linear cause effect.
Mm,
It's a loop. What happens inside through visualization, for example, through cognition, affects what's outside, and then what's outside affects what's inside, and so on and so on. And our goal, and really our goal as coaches, is to initiate upward spirals,
mm.
upward loops, rather than downward loops, which often are part of life.
Yeah, this it reminds me of I remember, years ago I did some NLP training, and they talked about the communication model, and they talked about this idea of, what's happening outside. We take it in, we filter it, we create imagery about it that then affects our behavior, and then we behave in the world, and then something else happens and we take that and we loop it. And then this idea that when you have two people doing that, there are these constant loops
Mm.
taking place. But as you're saying there's also the loop with self and the loop with others.
Yeah, and the loop with others is also another fascinating topic, of course. So, all the research on mirror neurons
Hmm.
is absolutely mind-boggling. The fact that our smile affects another person's smile, and their smile then affects another, and it affects us back. So we're constantly creating loops, and and especially with our Western mindset, we see the world as linear. Okay, so I'm a coach and I affected someone, and good job. It's much more than that. It's I'm a coach, I affected someone who then affects me, who
Yeah.
then affects other people who affect him. So there are constant loops. The butterfly effect is real, and I think it can, it can help us recognize the importance of our actions. Once again, of our actions, because with each action, we're creating ripple effects. When remember, this was probably when I was in college, or a bit before, when I first heard of the butterfly effect. A great burden was lifted off my shoulder, because I realized that I could simply be myself and still make a world of difference.
Well, that's really interesting because when we often talk about animus, this idea that showing up and being yourself with your client is of value. You don't need to do lots of things. You can just be in that space with them and hear, witness, and that creates an effect. It
Mm.
creates a shift. It creates a change. So we don't need to be doing lots of stuff. We can just experience. And we also talk about this idea of we are changed through the experience of coaching, not just our coachees.
Right.
So they're to recognize the learning that happens for us as well as the learning that happens for them, the thinking, the emergence, whatever that might be. It takes place on both sides. There isn't a singular thing that's happening.
Yeah, and this also goes to the idea of Gandhi's ideas of being the change. That we need to be open to change, so that the person we're speaking with is open to change as well. And I was intrigued, Robert, by what you said about how what we need to do is bring ourselves and be there, be present for them, and that often in and of itself initiates that upward loop, that upward
Mm.
spiral that we're looking for. And I'm thinking about Robert Greenleaf. So Robert Greenleaf was an organizational psychologist back in the 1970s, who was looking for the common characteristic or characteristics among the greatest leaders throughout history, whether it's political, religious, business. And he identified the concept. He came up with the idea of the leader as servant. And he went back with all the way to the biblical leaders, and he said, Moses was when did God pick Moses? When Moses ran after a lamb and served the lamb, brought him back to the herd, and then later Jesus came to serve the people. Fast forward 20th century, Gandhi was a servant of the people. Nelson Mandela, came out of prison after 27 years. The cameras are on him. He had some time to think about what he would say. What did he say? Looking at the cameras, I am your servant. These words came out of his mouth.
Mm.
You look at Anita Roddick, founder of The Body Shop, you read her book, Business as Unusual. It's all about service. Very successful business about serving the clients, serving the employees, serving Mother Earth. What is the work of the great coach as a servant? Now, the interesting thing is that when they looked at the single most important characteristic of a servant leader, listening, being present and listening, you don't have to do much more than that. Yes, of course, if you have great ideas and tips, and if you can shift the boat a little bit here or there, of course. But first and foremost, be present and listen.
That sort of makes me think about myself as a leader, and I'm sure it makes others think about themselves and ask that question. So, how am I showing up in
Mm.
service, and how am I able to listen? And especially when we have loads of ideas, or we think we have loads of ideas. So I know sometimes as leaders, we can think that we need to lead by doing and by
Mhm.
pulling everybody along, as opposed to having the conversations and exploring what is it we want to do? What's the collective wisdom and knowledge here that we can apply to a particular challenge or an endeavor that's at play? And I think it's really useful to remember uh, to listen as coaches and as leaders, because as coaches we know we listen. That's part of the process, that we go, yeah, that's what we do, but not always in the other facets of our lives, and bringing that into it. It kind of reminded me of something you said earlier as well, that idea of purpose. As a leader, what's the purpose? As a coach, what's the purpose? What we'll be trying to create? And part of happiness is meaning and purpose. When we bring those things into the space, they can fuel us or drive us forward.
Yeah. So, a couple of things. First thing is, I do think that the best training for leaders is coach training, because again, coaches serve. This is what servant leadership is all about. Coaches learn to listen. Coaches learn that they don't need to do it themselves. They need to create the conditions
Yeah.
to facilitate others doing it. And this is, one-to-one the work of the modern leader. So that's the first thing. The second thing is really connecting to purpose. That's so important. Friedrich Nietzsche said this in the 1800s. He said, "He who has a why can overcome any how." So if you find that why, that purpose for you, you can overcome hardships and difficulties. And one of the roles of a coach is to obviously to identify her purpose, lead by example, but then to help the coachee identify their purpose. And when they identify their purpose, it is important to make a distinction that Viktor Frankl made in his book Man's Search for Meaning, where he talked about meaning, purpose. He talked about the meaning of life and the meaning in life. And the meaning of life is, the grand meaning. Many people find it in religion, or I want to make the world a better place, or alleviate poverty, or save Earth, or whatever it is. That's the purpose of life. But it's no less important to connect to our purpose in life, which is the purpose in what we do day in and day out. Now, that's important again for the coach, him herself, as well as for the coach to help the coachee. And it's important to do because we know from a lot of research done by Amy Wisniewski, Jane Dutton, Adam Grant, and others, we know just how important it is to find the meaning in life, in our day-to-day, because that's when we become more productive, more creative, more engaged. That's when we enjoy better teamwork. That's when we can overcome more difficulties and hardships.
And I really liked what you were saying there as well about the coach's purpose. What's the coach's purpose? Because I think sometimes as coaches we can get a little lost in, I'm just a service. It's just to serve, and to go, okay, but what else is there? What's the richness of what it is that you bring, or you enable within the world? And I think that kind of leans into that meaning in life. So that, what's part of your day to day? Yes, you work with your clients to enable them to have those, meaningful and purposeful lives. But what's your day to day, and what does that mean for you, and what does that then create? Once again, it feels like another loop that kind of comes round here. So nothing's kind of separate; they kind of influence each other.
Yeah. Wherever you look, I believe you find loops, because loops are the Ralph Waldo Emerson, the North American philosopher, wrote an essay back in 1841 maybe, on circles. And he says, the world comprises circles. It's not straight lines. It's all about the interaction. The relationship is a circle. You look at, and by the way, this is not, obviously, it's not a Western culture. If anything, Emerson was an anomaly among Western philosophers to talk about this. You see this interaction, this loop between people, among people, in connecting us together. You see it in Asian culture, the yin and the yang. You see it in African culture, Ubuntu. And more recently, you see it in Western culture through the idea of systems thinking, where you're both a cause and an effect. And, systems thinking and the idea of Ubuntu, or the idea of yin and yang, they're not just nice ideas. They are invaluable guidelines, most certainly for coaches.
Yeah, I've always been really interested in circles. I think back from my drama days, everything was always about a circle, because in a circle you can see each other, you can all be seen, you can all connect. And so there's something really resonating there for me. And also this idea of the relationship. I've often said that the relationship's the most important thing in our coaching, or in our work, or in our wider relationships. Is how do we hold and create the quality of those relationships, because they then enable us to be vulnerable or strong, or to create change. But without the strength in those relationships, then that's not present, that's not part of what happens. And you're talking there about sort of systems thinking and cause and effect. And it made me think about some of the work of Simon Weston, where he sort of looks at, what are the systems that we live within, and how can we notice ourselves within those systems and notice the patterns that exist within those systems.
Yeah, so the reason why systems thinking and understanding systems is so important is not just so that we can delineate a structure, a coherent structure of relationships, of our environment. That's not an end in itself. The reason is so that we can find leverage points. Because if we understand the system and how it works, then we can see, oh, if I push here, then that is going to affect other things. And this is the way for a coach to think systemically rather than symptomatically. So how can I, as a coach, identify a leverage point in my coachee's life so that when they do this, it will affect that as well as this, and it will come back and affect the initial change that we introduced. And finding that is important. And I can think of an actual example. So Charles Duhigg talks about, in his book on habit, talks about keystone habits. And what are they are the central habits, the main habits, the important habits, that when you change them, you change other things. So for instance, one of the things that we know from research, and we don't really need research for it because we know it from personal experience, is how important physical exercise is. Not just for physical health, also for mental health.
Yeah.
So if I introduce just this one ritual into my life, that will have a trickle effect. That's a leverage point. Why? Because it also means that I'm not going to eat, certainly not junk, 2 or 3 hours before, because I don't want to feel bloated and hurt. So I'm going to take care of my eating, my nutrition a little bit better. And afterwards, I feel strong. I don't want to put junk into my body necessarily. And also I will sleep better if I exercise regularly. And that will affect my mood, as will the exercise itself, which means I'll be nicer to my partner or kids or friends, which means they'll be nicer back right at me. A loop. And all that started with a leverage point, in this case, exercise. Now that's a simple one. Obviously, for a coach to identify leverage points takes more effort and more understanding. And that's where listening comes in. So that through listening, I can create an explicit or sometimes an implicit picture, gestalt of my coachee. and then say, okay, I'm going to press here. And if it doesn't work, that's okay, because then I can try here. Experiment. Gandhi called his, or titles his autobiography, My Experiments with Truth. Not my finding truth, not my discovery or spreading of truth, my experiments with truth. And that is, I think, also an important call for coaches. How can we experiment with truths, find those leverage points?
And I also think that when we work with our clients, that leverage point is found by them. So the coach, as you were saying, creates the conditions for the leverage points to emerge into the space and for us to go, so what happens if we do that? And I love that word experiment. It's one of the things that I often bring into the space. Well, let's do an experiment. Let's see what happens. Because when we talk about experimenting, we know that it might fail. So we don't hold on to it with this tightness that it's going to work. We're going, oh, we're going to try something and we're just going to see what happens. We're going to take that evidence and then we're going to do something with it. And I remember years ago, I gave up drinking. And to start with, it was only like I was doing it for a month for a charity. And then I was like, I'm just going to do an experiment to see how long this can go on for. It's just an experiment. I haven't given up drinking. I'm just experimenting with something to see what happens. And by placing that in my mind, it allowed me to go much longer than I would have if I went, I've given this up. Because I think sometimes when we put those harsh lines in, we then become defensive against those lines. That desire to push back kicks in. But when we go, we're just playing with this, we're experimenting, it gives it a lightness. And I think sometimes we can go further, especially within a coaching space. We can go further with being playful and experimenting because it has that lightness to it. It doesn't carry that weight with it.
Exactly. And it also has to do with what we spoke about earlier, because if I decide to stop drinking, that is a cognitive decision. There is finality to it. That's it. I'm no longer a drinker. I've changed. As opposed to I'm experimenting, I'm trying it out, and then we put it into action. And then the action over time can change our thought.
So we're talking here, and I'm loving this conversation. I feel like we could kind of keep going forever, but I sort of wanted to understand, how did you come to this work? What was it that sort of triggered you into this space?
Yeah, desperation.
Okay, tell me a bit about that.
I'll elaborate. I became interested in happiness because of my own unhappiness. So I was an undergraduate studying computer science, and I found myself doing very well academically, doing very well in athletics. I played professional squash, doing fairly well socially, and yet I was miserable. And I didn't understand why. I always believed that I just need to check these boxes and then I'll live happily ever after. And I checked those boxes, or at least many of them. And not only did it not make me happy, over time, I became less happy. Why? Because every time I'd achieve something, I became happy for a while. But then I went back to where I was before, only worse, because now I had to achieve even more just to get to the same level of well-being. And I realized that I was on this treadmill, or rather I was like Sisyphus climbing, pushing the rock up the mountain. And then I get to the top and the ball rolls down and I have to push it up. Only now the mountain has just become a little bit steeper. And I get it up, and every time it rolls down, it becomes steeper and more difficult. And I said, something's wrong with this model. And one day, my second year in university, I went to my academic advisor and I told her I'm switching majors. And she said, what to? And I said, well, I'm leaving computer science, moving over to philosophy and psychology. And she said, why? And I said, because I have two questions. One is, why aren't I happy? Two, how can I become happier? And it's with these two questions that I then went on to get my undergraduate, and then over to your Cambridge to read education, and then back to the other Cambridge for my PhD, all the time focusing on how can I help myself, individuals, couples, organizations, nations increase levels of well-being. And that's what, that's 30 years ago.
So there's, that classic example of that tick box list that we
Yeah.
go through in life, where we go, when I get here, I will feel like this. When I get here, I will feel like this, devoid of that purpose and meaning, but this external idea or sensation that when we get to these places, happiness will emerge into the space, as opposed to by being happy or creating our own happiness, our own validations, that then the world becomes a happier place. And those things that we are striving for, we either achieve them and that's great, or we don't achieve them and that's okay, as opposed to getting there being the thing. And I think this is sometimes the challenge with solution focused coaching or action orientated coaching, is that sometimes we can get a little bit caught in the idea that when we get there, the thing will happen, as opposed to how do we bring the thing with us on that journey.
Yeah, Robert, this is the issue to my mind when it comes to coaching, because coaching in many ways, and this is how it's described by many, is about helping the coachee achieve their goals, to get there. And essentially, there are two schools of thought that, when it comes to goals in relation to happiness. The first school of thought says just this: happiness is about getting there. Happiness is about getting to that peak of the mountain. Happiness is about achieving that. Happiness is about fulfilling your dreams, your objectives, your goals. This is happiness. But then there's research showing that that's not exactly the case. That very often when we get there, very quickly we realize that there is no there. That within months or weeks or sometimes hours of having achieved a goal that we've had for 10, 20 years, we go back to where we were before, only more disappointed and disillusioned than we were before. So it's not about achieving that goal when it comes to happiness. So you have the alternative school that says, you see, you won't be happy. How will you be happy? If you learn to focus on the here and now, on the present. And roughly speaking, very broad brush strokes here, I'm overgeneralizing. The first school is the Western school. It's about the future. The second school, about the present, is the Eastern school. There is also, though, a problem with the second school, with the Eastern school, with the present-oriented school. Why? Because we are future-oriented beings. We are about goal setting. Goals, objectives matter. They inspire us. We aspire to them. It's also part of being human. And the challenge is to bring these two worlds together. How do we do that? Here is a solution, not the only solution, but a solution. How do we synthesize these two worlds, the future orientation and the present, the goals, the destination, and the journey, the here and now? How do we do that? We do that by having goals. It's part of our nature to aspire, to be inspired by goals. And once we have those goals that are meaningful, that are purposeful, that are important to us, we let go. And then we have the goals in the back of our minds, keeping us on track. But where are we? We're on track in the present moment. And I'll give you a simple example, a personal example. So my publisher told me that we're getting my book out on April 27th. Very clear goal. It's a specific date. We know exactly when it's going to happen. We know what it's going to look like. It has all the elements of a SMART goal. Now that I know that on April 27th, the book is going to come out, I don't need to think about it anymore. I can come back to the track. I can come back to the present moment. And every morning when I wake up, I know that for 3 to 4 hours, I write. And when I write, I experience a sense of flow and a sense of presence. Not every moment, but a lot of the time. And this way, by having this future goal, Essentially, what it does is it liberates me to enjoy the present moment. Because if I don't have a future goal and I wake up in the morning and I say, what am I going to do today? I wonder, and should I do, well, no, let me try this or that. That's not a prescription for happiness. Yes, maybe for a day or two or a week, but not for a lifetime. Whereas when I know that I have a clear goal, I'm taking care of my future-oriented nature, and at the same time, taking care of liberating the present moment, which is also potentially a part of my nature. I'm enjoying the destination on the way to a meaningful, I'm enjoying the journey on the way to a meaningful, purposeful destination.
This sort of, I'm not quite sure why this image came into mind as you were saying that, but it feels like this idea that, you're in the middle of the field and there's lots of tall grass and you stand tall and you go, that I'm going to go over there, and you pick a destination of where you want to head. And then you get back in the grass and you enjoy moving through. And then you go, wait a minute, let me just check. And you go up and go, yeah, we're going in the right direction. And then we get back into it and we enjoy this idea that it's almost like there was this, I guess, a twofold vision or a twofold way of looking at things. It's kind of, we go up, we look at the bigger picture of where we're going, and then we come back down and we enjoy the detail of what we're doing. And then we come up, bigger picture, back into the detail. And that way we're kind of flipping between these two ways of thinking and not caught in any single one of them.
Yes, and it's exactly right. It's the interplay between the present, zooming in on the present, and then zooming out on the future. And whenever we need to get a sense of direction, then we can look up to that mountain you described, and then we can go back to, enjoying the journey, enjoying the flowers that are right next to us.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was Gary Vaynerchuk who talked about clouds and dirt. And he talks about you've got to be in the clouds with a big vision, but you also got to get on the ground and tussle in the dirt in order to do this. And I think Richard Branson talks about this as well, this idea that that often great leaders are able to hold that big picture and the next step in mind.
Yeah, even more generally, Howard Gardner from Harvard Graduate School of Education talks about great leaders being able to hold simultaneously two seemingly opposite ideas and bridging them with an and rather than with an or.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm a big fan of the and, how can we do this and that? Let's not go this way or that way. How can we do both things? How can we bring the energy or the resources to enable those things to happen?
Yeah, and in this respect, we have the Western approach, future orientation, and the Eastern approach, present orientation, coexisting.
And as we talk about this, it makes me wonder how your computer science sort of supported or impacted your thinking and your work. I just wonder how those things fuse as well, because there's the philosophy on one side and then there's computer science on the other, and they are also, I'm not sure if they are polar opposites, but they're also differences that we can hold at the same time.
Yeah, and and in our culture, they are perceived as opposites. I mean, radical opposites. I look at the psychology department in universities, and they don't talk to the philosophy department. They certainly don't talk to the computer science department. I mean, what language are we going to talk? C or what? And they also don't speak among themselves. So the social psychologists wouldn't talk to the cognitive psychologists, the neuroscientists wouldn't talk to the developmental psychologists, or certainly not enough. And that's unfortunate, because we are living in an interdisciplinary world. We are living in an interconnected world. And there is a great deal that we can all learn from each other. More than that, there's a great deal that we need to learn from each other. I mean, look at all the research, all the work on creativity. Creativity doesn't come when we delve just into our very specific field. It always comes when we venture outside, and then we bring ideas from geometry to physics, Einstein, from music to physics, Niels Bohr, or from computer science to psychology, from engineering to psychology, Peter Senge, systems thinking.
Mm.
And we need much more of that interdisciplinary conversation where we're, because ultimately we're in this together. We're interconnected. Our fates are interconnected. Our objectives, our ultimate purpose is very much aligned.
Yeah, I love the idea of that interconnectedness. It's something that we often speak about when we're training coaches is this idea of, excuse me, of not leaving your past life behind. Often people go, I was a this, I no longer do that. I want to be a coach and I'm shifting my whole world. And I often say, but don't leave that behind because there is knowledge and information and
Yes.
resources in that world that you can bring across. You might need to leave it for a moment, but don't abandon it. Bring it with you.
I could not agree more. And so it's not just that we mustn't leave what we've done behind, even if that thing is not directly related to what we're going to do now or in the future. We need to continue exploring things that may be seemingly unrelated to our field. So let's say in the past we studied computer science. Well, we can continue to study computer science even if we're engaged with psychology. And more than that, why not also study physics if that is something that's interesting to me, or film, or history? Everything is interconnected. When I started off as a philosopher, I had an amazing teacher. His name is Ohad Kamin, and he said to me, "Tal, you will know that you understand philosophy when you can understand the relationship between pizza and politics." And I said, "Say what?" And he said, "Just go and study." And I think, 30 years hence, I understand more of what he's talking about. When we're able to see the connection between what we did in the past and what we're doing now, or another field that we're exploring that seemingly has no connection to coaching, but it can make all the difference with some of our clients if we know how to bring it in creatively and make those connections. This is the difference between good and great.
It sort of makes me think about some of the people I've been speaking to recently, like Andrea Watts, around creativity and coaching. So she does collage and coaching, and it sort of was born out of the artwork that she was doing and a desire to bring art into that space, but to
Fantastic.
bring it into the space in a way that didn't create a nervousness or an anxiety because somebody's going, well, I can't draw, but we can all collect images out of a magazine and put them together and then explore what this means for us, and this idea of how do we bring these different things into the coaching space or different spaces to then see, what's the newness that they bring or fire for us.
Yeah, and I think it's a great example because there is so much that we can learn about everything that we do through through art, or for that matter, through sports, or for that matter, through business. Everything that we do, we can learn from, and it applies to our personal lives. And everything in our personal lives can apply to our professional lives as well, to our art creation,
Mm.
to the way we interact with others on a sport on a sports field. So seeing these interconnections, which is of course about seeing life as a system.
Yeah. And it's interesting. It makes me think about when I first started as a coach, and I was very evangelical about coaching, and that created its own issues with the people around me. But when I was able then to connect what I was doing with what they were doing, not so much in an evangelical way, but more as if you tried this, or if you think about it in that way, and there was a gentler bridging of their world and
Mhm.
my world, that something magical happened, and it became instead of this tussle of opinions and schools of belief, it became a connection, a dialogue, a joining. And it just kind of, as you were saying that, it reminded me of my own tussles
Yeah.
with how coaching felt very separate to everything else for a while. And it took me time to kind of connect it to the rest of my world.
Yeah. So as you're speaking, I'm thinking of two things. One is you use the word dialogue. Dialogue is a word that Peter Senge talks about as the essence of systems, because it's not a one-way
Mm,
preaching, but rather a two-way loop. It's a
yeah.
dialogue. And the second thing that I'm thinking of, how in Taoism, Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching writes about soft is hard, and he gives the metaphor of water
Yeah.
and how water can ultimately bring about the most positive change.
Lovely. Whenever I hear that, I always think about the great interview with Bruce Lee where he talks about being like water, and I'm just like, oh wow, that always kind of gives me goosebumps. So Tal, I mean, I hear this and I think to myself, so what's next for you? Where are you taking this next? What's the evolution of this work for you?
So, I had a aha moment 5 years ago when I was on a flight, and that changed the trajectory of my life. And a question came to mind on that flight, and the question was, how is it that there is a field of study for psychology, which had been my field, or philosophy, or history, or coaching, or biology, or geography, or you name it, and there is no field of study for happiness? Yeah, there is a positive psychology, but that's just the psychology of happiness. What about what philosophers had to say about happiness, and theologians, and neuroscientists, and economists, and films and literature? Why isn't there a field, or rather an interdisciplinary field of study that brings together all of what these disciplines had to say about the good life? And on that flight 5 years ago, I resolved to help create an interdisciplinary field of happiness studies. And that's what I've been doing since. I created the Happiness Studies Academy, co-founded it with a few of my colleagues, and we're offering certificate programs. Soon we'll offer the first master's degree in happiness studies. And essentially, when people attend our certificate programs or future academic programs, there are two questions that we attempt to answer. The first question is, how can I become happier? Second question, how can I help others become happier? And that is helpful. It's useful in and of itself because, we all want to be happier. Also as a means towards other ends. Because we know when we increase levels of well-being, even by a little bit, creativity goes up, productivity goes up, engagement goes up, relationships improve, our physical health improves, and the list goes on. So happiness as an end in itself is desirable, as well as a means towards other ends.
Tal, that sounds amazing, and I can feel myself being drawn into studying some of this work as well. The idea of how can I become more happy? There's something really um, enlivening about that and playful about that exploration of what's the experiments that I can do to bring that about for myself, and then what's the experiments one can do to bring that about or facilitate that for others. And perhaps that is coaching, but perhaps that's other things as well. And it's interesting to kind of go on that journey of exploration.
Yeah, every student in our master's degree will go through a very intensive coaching course, because what coaching is about is applying it to the world, bringing it to people, serving it forward.
Tal, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. If people want to get hold of you, if they want to find you, where's the best place for them to do that?
My website is Tal Ben-Shahar, all one word, .com. And there they'll find links to the Happiness Studies Academy, to Potentialife, which is an organization that is about bringing happiness to companies, to organizations, as well as my writings.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Robert.